Hello and welcome to the Arthur V. Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice at St. Paul's College on the campus of the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. My name is Charlotte Enns, and I'm the director of the Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice here at St. Paul's College. And I would like to begin by acknowledging that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. The Brown Bag Lecture Series, which you are joining us for today, was established in 2006, and today's lecture is the 6th of 7 Brown Bag lectures of this academic year. So they're still going very strong. This year, our lectures feature the alumni and students of the Peace and Conflict Studies graduate programs. And it was almost 20 years ago, in the fall of 2001, that Dr. Arthur Morrow, an alumnus of the University of Manitoba and St. Paul's College, made a gift to found this Arthur V. Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice. And part of the Institute's evolution was the founding of the University of Manitoba's Peace and Conflict Studies graduate programs. First the PhD program, and then the joint master's program with the University of Winnipeg. We would like to thank the alumni and students and the PAX program itself for its ongoing support and participation in the Brown Bag Lecture Series. So this year's Brown Bag Lectures are available on the Morrow Institute YouTube channel as well. So getting to today, we are very excited to welcome Dr. Stephanie Stobbe and Dr. Wendy Kroeker, both alumni of the PAX program. Congratulations and hooray, and welcome here. Dr. Stephanie Stobbe is an associate professor of conflict resolution studies at Menno Simons College, a college of Canadian Mennonite University, and at the University of Winnipeg. And Dr. Wendy Kroeker is Assistant Professor of Peace and Conflict Transformation Studies at Canadian Mennonite University and Academic Director of the Canadian School of Peacebuilding. Both Stephanie's and Wendy's personal research efforts include a focus on peace and conflict issues in an Asian context, and those efforts, along with the efforts of colleagues, have led to the creation of the Lexington book series, Conflict Resolution and Peacebuilding in Asia, for which Stephanie serves as editor and contributor, and Wendy as a contributor and author. So we are very pleased to welcome them today, and you'll hear from them very shortly, but I just want to pass the microphone to my colleague and manager of the Morrow Institute, Jason Brennan, for a few brief words of welcome and housekeeping to get us started with today's lecture. Over to you, Jason.
Thank you, Charlotte, and it's great to have everyone here today. Since I started with the Morrow Institute in 2014, I've hosted 50 or 60 of these brown bag lectures, most of them, of course, in person, not online like this. Back in 2016, we had Stephanie Stobbe here to talk about her book, Conflict Resolution and Peacebuilding in Laos, and it was a very compelling and memorable lecture. A compelling case was made for the grassroots conflict resolution structure that challenged sort of our Western concepts of conflict resolution, the legal process, and justice. And Stephanie, it ranks as one of my favorites of the 50 or 60 that we've had because of the compelling nature of and importance of that message. And I think we'll hear a little more on that related topic from you today. So thank you for your past participation. Thank you to both of you for joining us today to tell us a little bit more about the work that you've been doing recently, and of course the book series that has been created out of some of that work. So with that, Stephanie, I will turn it over to you and look forward to hearing from you just before we do that, folks, as we go on and as the lecture portion winds down, please feel free to post your questions in the Q&A. We'll do our very best to get to your questions in that section of today's lecture. And Stephanie, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Jason and Dr. Enns, for the introduction and for inviting me to come and share with you the book series, Conflict Resolution and Peacebuilding in Asia. It's great to also have the author from the newest addition to the series, Dr. Wendy Kroeker, with us today. So Conflict Resolution and Peacebuilding in Asia is a new book series by Lexington Books, a division of Rowman and Littlefield Publishing. The field of peace and conflict studies acknowledges the importance of culture in the theory and practice of conflict resolution, but often takes a simplistic view of culture studied. So the series explore the many processes of resolution that are found in Asia, accounting along the way for the complex mix of distinct ethnic groups and their contrasting languages, cultural lineages, and practices. Books in the series will move beyond the typical top-down negotiation styles to look at the wide variety of negotiation and mediation styles used by billions of people living in the region, adding to our understanding of conflict resolution in Asia. As the editor, I've put together an advisory board to help me review these topics. They are scholars and practitioners in the field and have great interest in cross-cultural perspective of conflict resolution and peace building. We have Dr. Jay Rothman, Dr. Honggang Yang, Dr. Ellen Judd, Dr. Paul Redekop, and Charles Crumpton. And the staff editorial is Eric Kuntzman. This book series includes studying the whole Asia continent, from Northern, Western, Central, Eastern, Southeastern, and Southeast Asia. So if any of you are interested in submitting an original manuscript, contact myself or Eric Kuntzman. So our very first book in the series is Conflict Resolution in Asia, Mediation and Other Cultural Models. That was published in 2018 and republished in paperback in 2020. And this volume is edited by myself, and there are contributions from 12 different authors. Conflict Resolution in Asia, Mediation and Other Cultural Models is an exploration of human interaction, conflict, and conflict resolution in the incredibly diverse regions that consist of South, East, and Southeast Asia. It examines how traditional, indigenous, and culturally based conflict resolution processes interact with more formal legal systems to build infrastructures that address conflicts at the interpersonal to international levels in ways that maintain social harmony. This book provides insights into situations where unique cultures come together to create larger cultural identity and how appropriate conflict resolution systems can work every day to establish positive relationships and overall peace in complex communities. It demonstrates the importance of culture in addressing conflict and conflict resolution and validates the significance of culturally appropriate processes in building and sustaining peace. The 9 countries studied represent very different cultural groups with complex national histories and varying degrees of influence from Western powers. Using select Asian nations as case studies of conflict resolution systems, this edited book examines the power of mediation and other cultural conflict resolution models as a tool for addressing social justice. The second book in our series, Identity, Rights and Awareness, Anti-Caste Activism in India and the Awakening of Justice Through Discursive Practices by Jeremy Rinker. For over a decade, Jeremy Rinker has interacted, observed, and studied Dalit anti-caste social movements in India. In this critical comparative approach to India's modern anti-caste resistance, the book emphasizes the complex interdependence between narrative practices and social transformation in understanding the centuries old caste basis of India's most fundamental of social conflicts. Through the comparative case study of 3 modern social movement organizations, this book provides a fresh lens to both better understand and potentially transform caste marginalization and oppression. Through theoretical analysis, autoethnographic field notes, and narrative storytelling, Dr. Rinker brings the lived experience of modern Dalits to life for a Western reader unfamiliar with the entrenched nature of India's complex caste system. And finally, our latest publication, Multidimensional Peacebuilding, Local Actors in the Philippine Context by Wendy Kroeker. As the author is here to present, I will leave it to Dr. Kroeker to discuss her book. As mentioned earlier, conflict resolution in Asia, mediation, and other cultural models is an exploration of human interaction, conflict, and conflict resolution in an incredibly diverse region that consists of South, East, and Southeast Asia. All the authors, scholars of the different chapters I selected were native to the country studied or have lived or worked there for a number of years and speak the language of the country. So as you can see here in the table of contents, the Southeast Asia section begins with Indonesia, the role of the traditional indigenous Musyawarah Mufakat process of mediation by Fatah Abdul Sikukur and Dale Bagshaw. The next chapter looks at Laos, Oplom, the language of conflict resolution and mediation models by Stephanie Stobbe. The next chapter looks at the Philippines, traditional peacemaking processes among indigenous populations in the northern and southern Philippines by Bruce Barnes and Federico Magdalena. The next chapter is Thailand, Thai cultural values and the role of third parties in addressing conflicts by Vanjai Vatananasap and Stephanie Stobbe. The chapter on Singapore focuses on cultural influences in the historical and institutional development of mediation by Joel Lee. And finally, Vietnam, culturally and legally appropriate mediation for dispute resolution in Vietnam by Charles Crumpton. The next section looks at East Asia. So we have a chapter from mainland China, the Gonghui Mediation Committee, Yu Weihui Neighborhood Committee, and the He Shi Lao Peacemaker and Other Cultural Models of Conflict Resolution by Echo Yi Lao and Cheryl Quanru Zhang. And then we have a chapter on Hong Kong, looking at mediation and the future of dispute resolution by Nadia Alexander. And the last section focused on South Asia. We have a chapter on India, looking at the Panchayat mediation and Lok Aladat People's Court conciliation and the institutionalization of ADR by Geetha Ravindra. So today I will focus on the chapter that I contributed to that edited volume, looking at Laos, Oplom, the language of conflict resolution and mediation models. This comes from my larger, more comprehensive study found in Conflict Resolution and Peacebuilding in Laos, Perspective for Today's World, that was published by Routledge. And so I have a chapter in the current conflict resolution in Asia, mediation and other cultural models, looking at Laos. So this is where Laos is located. It is called Laos, or the Lao People's Democratic Republic. It is a small landlocked country here in Southeast Asia, surrounded by 5 countries. So to the north by China, to the east by Vietnam, to the south by Cambodia, to the southwest by Thailand, and to the west by Myanmar or Burma. Just some background information on Laos. It has a population of about 7.2 million, according to the UN. It is considered a multi-ethnic society with 49 to 240 plus ethnic groups. And each ethnic group is distinct with its own language, food, and customs. The Lao government currently recognizes 49 ethnic groups. Traditionally, it has been categorized into 3 categories: the Lao Lum, who make up 68% of the population, the Lao Tung, making up 22%, and the Lao Sung with 9%. And even within these categories, there are numerous ethnic groups. And the legal system, when you talk to the Lao people, you will see that it is underdeveloped. There are about 144 practicing lawyers. And so you can see that they rely very little on the legal system to resolve their disputes. And their legal system is made up of traditional customs, French legal procedures, as it was part of French Indochina. And since it has become a communist country, they have utilized some of the socialist practices. And the legal system is inaccessible, it's expensive, similar to our processes here in Canada. But the people in Laos have no knowledge of their legal rights, and the rule of law is applied inconsistently, depending on who you know and whether you can pay off sometimes the lawyers or judges. And so people rely on the importance of traditional conflict resolution processes. And one of the people who were instrumental in assisting me was Professor Ajahn Suksaveng from Dong Dak University in Vientiane, Laos. He is of Khmer ethnic background, which is an ethnic minority group living in Laos. And as I mentioned earlier, each ethnic group is very distinct. And in terms of their language, food, and culture, including specific clothing. So if you look at the picture and look at the clothing behind us, the design and style of the clothing is characteristic of a Khmer culture and Khmer ethnic group. I also had research assistants, university students who were from social work or other sciences and medicine, and they were amazing in helping me conduct interviews in Laos. Other research assistants are social workers, NGOs, social work professor, and university students, as I mentioned earlier. And it was really important for me to have local research assistants who understand the language and culture of the people being interviewed. And that's why I was really excited to have them come on board to assist me with this research. Here's another picture of another research assistant, Kamon, who works for an international NGO. And we interviewed people in urban centers as well as rural areas in order to gain a variety of perspectives on this topic. And so when you look at the materials that emerge from the research, it shows that Laos has an elaborate system of conflict resolution structures in terms of mediation and ritual systems. So looking at the mediation system and looking at the Lao conflict resolution spectrum that I developed as a result of the research, including different forms of mediation. And then there is the ritual system, culturally specific conflict resolution and reconciliation rituals, the Sukwan and the Suma, which I will not talk about today, but will be focusing on the mediation systems. And so when you look at the Lao conflict resolution spectrum, it is a continuum of processes to resolve conflicts, from going from 1, discussion, problem solving, or Oplom, all the way to 10, the Supreme Court, or Sansung. And when you look at the spectrum, you can see that the very first option that people use to resolve their dispute is having a direct discussion or problem solving Oplom with the person that they have a conflict with. And if that doesn't work and they can't resolve it, that's when they move into the next 5 levels of mediation. So the first level is the parents' mediation, where you have the parents act as mediators to help you resolve your dispute. And if you still can't resolve it at that level, that's when you move into the relatives mediation, having an older aunt or uncle act as mediators to help resolve the dispute. And if that still doesn't work, you have another option of going to the elders for mediation. And these are elders in the communities who are well respected by the people living in those communities. And if that still doesn't work, that's when you move to the village leader mediation. And just a note that a village refers to both a small rural community and a neighborhood or subdivision within a city, similar to St. Vital or River Heights, Wolseley, Transcona. So every village will have a village leader, and those leaders can play the role of a mediator. And the last level of mediation is the Village Mediation Committee, or what we call the Noi Gai Gia. And the conflicts in Laos rarely go beyond the last mediation level, the Noi Gai Gia level. And if it does, then they can go to the village court, district court, provincial court, and finally the Supreme Court. And in all the interviews that I conducted, I believe over 150 interviews, only one person could even tell a firsthand story about somebody who had used the court system. And it was a conflict between two brothers who started a business together. The younger brother did not have money, so he borrowed money from his older brother and said he would repay the loan once the business started to make a profit. However, the business did not perform well, and they eventually the business fell apart. And at this point, the elder brother asked the younger brother to repay the loan, and the younger brother refused because the business did not make any money. And so they tried to resolve things at the parents' level, relatives, elders, village leaders, and even at the Noi Gai Gia level, but they could not resolve it. And so they eventually went to the court system, went through the court system to try and resolve their conflict. And to this day, they are no longer talking with one another as a result of the court process. And so there was one case that actually went through the court system that I heard of in my research study. And so the Lao conflict resolution discusses the importance of Oplom in problem solving and mediation. And so the process of Oplom is a way of listening, discussing, teaching, reminding, and advising parties to resolve their disputes in constructive ways. Oplom is a term that is used only in reference to conflict and conflict resolution. It means much more than just talking or speaking and signifies a process of active and intense counseling and advising for the purposes of helping parties understand each other in conflict situation. The Oplom goes beyond facilitation of discussion between parties, and depending on the situation, can function as therapy, teaching, and legal advice, which is very, very different than the Western model of mediation that we have. And so there are 5 levels of mediation, as I mentioned earlier, and there is this natural progression of levels of mediation, moving from parents to relatives, to elders, to village leaders, and the Noi Gai Gia. If you look at the level of the parents' mediation, the process tends to be more informal. It's private. There are no fees associated with that. The reparation is small. The participants are few because it's just you and the party you have a conflict with and the parents. And so there is low psychological costs associated with that. But as you move up to the various levels of mediation and finally to the Noi Gai Gia, it becomes more formalized, it's more public, and there is a fee associated with that level. And the reparation tends to be larger, and many participants are involved because the mediators from the previous sessions of mediation are invited to the next level. And so if you are at the relatives level, then the parents who acted as mediators are also invited to the next mediation session and be involved in helping resolve the conflict. And if you get all the way to the Noi Gai Gia, you have the parties in conflict, as well as the parent mediator, the relative mediator, elder mediator, and the village leader mediator present at the Noi Gai Gia mediation. So this is something that is very, very unique in Laos that is not found in anywhere in the world in terms of mediation. And so when you look at the Noi Gai Gia, or the Village or Community Mediation Committee, It consists of 7 representatives in the committee representing different groups living in the community. So you have the village leader, who often acts as a facilitator of the process. You have an elder, you had an informal mediator, a women's union representative, a young people's representative, a police representative, and the military representative present as part of that committee. So some of the conflicts that go through the Noigaigia include family conflicts, such as separation and divorce and inheritance issues, workplace conflicts, such as lazy employees and project loans, and community conflicts, such as land disputes and neighbor disputes. And so there are some key characteristics of Lao conflict resolution processes. One is the progression of dispute resolution. Cultural norms and expectations require parties to go to their families first for assistance. And that's why you see the parents and relatives mediation. And from there, you go to the next levels of mediation and then finally through the court processes. So there is this natural progression of dispute resolution processes. And the second characteristic is the inclusion of other mediators in subsequent processes. As I said earlier, this is very unique and not seen in any other models of mediation around the world. And having these mediators present at the next level of mediation provides natural support, ensures consistency, transparency, and accountability on part of the mediators, because they can share firsthand what happened at the previous mediation, and also ensures that they are accountable and that they did everything they could to help the parties resolve conflicts at that previous level. And then the next characteristic is the opportunities for a resolution. So at each level of mediation, you are required to attend mediation at least 3 times in order to modify and implement the agreements at each level of mediation. So by the time you go through the 5 levels of mediation, you will have gone through 15 mediation sessions before you are allowed to go through and use the legal system to resolve your dispute. So there is ample opportunity to resolve conflicts at the various mediation levels. And the next characteristic is the cost associated with an escalation of conflict. And so fees begin at the Noigaigia level at 50,000 GIP, or about $5. And this is a lot of money, considering that people have a salary of maybe $100 per month in that country. And so there is this incremental increase in fees for upper level conflict resolution services. So as you go through the legal system, it becomes much more expensive. And so there is a strong incentive to resolve conflicts at the lower levels. But there are unresolved conflicts within these systems. For example, conflicts involving drugs. Marijuana and opium were used traditionally for medicinal purposes to treat upset stomach and to relieve pain. Today, there is a tough policy on drugs, and the government is sending young addicts to rehabilitation camps. And also the use of meth, or yaba, has become a real concern as a cheap drug in the country. And so this is a difficult issue to resolve. And land appropriation is another dispute that is very complex. So there's a story in my interview where a farmer whose land was taken away in order to build a school. Now he has been given land at a location that's 2 to 3 hours away from where he lives, creating great difficulty for the farmer. And so just note that Laotians do not own lands, but they are given land to use by the government, as it is a communist state. Other government regulations, such as relocation. Again, if there is a dam that is being built, then the government might relocate a whole village to a different area, creating a lot of difficulty for the locals. Another example is the prohibition of squid and rice farming, which has been a part of the Laotian cultural history in terms of subsistence farming. And now they are encouraged to grow cash crops such as rubber trees, soybeans, sugarcane, coffee, and tea. And so this has created some hardship for the farmers who are not used to growing cash crops, but need to grow rice in order to feed their families. And so I'll conclude with this slide. So from the chapter, you can see that understanding culture and cultural conflict resolution is key to building relationships and reconciliation. And Lao conflict resolution processes can be placed along a continuum, a Lao conflict resolution continuum, from the most simple, least costly to most complex, expensive legalistic form of dispute resolution, including looking at the different 5 levels of mediation in Laos. And there is procedural justice found in mediation, as the mediation processes have fairness, consistency, transparency built right into the processes of mediation. So thank you. And now I will turn it over to Wendy, and I will share her slide for us here.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you, Jason and Charlotte, for this invitation back to my alma mater. And Charlotte actually put in extra time on that. She was on my dissertation committee, and that was a wonderful experience together. And thank you, Stephanie, as part of this Asia series from Lexington. Had a great experience with Eric and Alexandra. And now the book has just come out, and this evening I will actually be able to have a book in my hands. So I'm excited about that. So let's move to a discussion of the Philippines, and you'll see shortly why I have entitled it my Multidimensional Peacebuilding, and I will say something about the image on the cover a little bit further down. So let's move to the table of contents. So here's the table of contents, and the way this book is framed is to begin to lay the land for this study, focus really on hearing people's stories, and then setting out the context of what are the great impacts that have occurred in Philippine society and history, what are the legacies that then have shaped the kind of very active civil society that has emerged in the Philippines for peace building, and chapters 7, 8, and 9 focus on what has emerged out of the context that's laid out in the initial chapters. Next slide. So why research on the Philippines? I know I always wonder, you know, what brought someone to that book and that topic? And maybe you might be wondering, it may not be such an obvious thing. I've spent 25 years now living and working in the Philippines. My children went to elementary school there. We worked at a university, and I've been very much involved with grassroots peace builders. But Philippines also is a very rich context because of multiplicity of issues and the historical challenges. It's a very complex environment for peace building. But out of that, a very strong civil society has emerged. And the island of Mindanao in the south, where I focused my work, is really in particular rich in resources and natural beauty, but yet struggles with corruption, abuses, economic disparities, discriminations, overcoming a colonial legacy, and all sorts of efforts towards pacification of activists and communities that are expressing their views. And despite all those things, a very strong group of peace builders have emerged. Many of them gather under their group name called Peace Weavers, and do amazing work that I wanted to explore further. Many of these folks have been friends for 25 years. And Philippine voices really have not been heard within the field of peace building. And so pushing at this sort of current topic within peace building of looking towards traditional wisdoms, voices of local peace builders, this seemed a context really ripe for learning and contributing to thinking through what really creates the fertile ground for significant and sustainable peace building to occur. And then chapters 2 through 5 go through these themes of significance of context, colonial legacy, trauma, greed and grievance over environmental issues, culture and identity, who are local actors. Many of my peace building friends would say I'm a local actor because I have spent a lot of time working in various places and involved deeply in those. But obviously I don't come from the Philippines. I'm a Manitoban prairie girl, and that kind of cross-cultural conversation between us in the course of this book and the research was a very rich time. And then just looking at what are the parameters of peace and peace building. Next slide. So you've seen this with Stephanie's presentation. Want to just say, look at the names of the countries that surround the Philippines. And so not only is its own historical context rich with learning and shaping for peace building, but is surrounded by very acute stories of histories that have really shaped a lot of peace building work that probably isn't as well known in North America as it should be. Next slide. Here's the area where I focus. The two circled areas in the island of Mindanao are places where I did my interviews. And the next slide. So I interviewed 36 folks, all from different kind of groups. You can see from the table the kind of folks that I encountered. Used a grounded theory, and as most of you know, that means I start with an opening question, and it was, what is your peace work? And some really amazing stories emerged out of that and brought me to my closing question, which was, how do you define peace? And that emerged as a chapter of its own. Further down, I'll touch on it only briefly, but this idea of one's history, one's story, one's definitions, one's work, those kind of contextualities are just such a rich weaving of place for learning. Next slide. So where are some of the cutting edges that emerged? And one of those I found in the idea of tinikling. Tinikling is the dance that you see here, and I decided to use that as my book cover because in conversation of the kind of findings that were beginning to emerge for me, I did a sort of party with all of the folks that I interviewed and said, here's kind of what I'm leaning towards, what I'm hearing from you in terms of themes. And I'm wondering of kind of a metaphor, since most of you are speaking in terms of metaphors to me, what might emerge? And through a very kind of funny and friendly but provocative conversation, we arrived at thinking Filipinos do peace building like their dance tinikling. And I began to research that dance. And one of the authors looking at that, she came to the conclusion that as these bamboo poles are knocking together and the dancers are moving their feet in between, trying to avoid getting their ankles crushed, that it looked like a local bird, a heron, as it jumps to avoid the bamboo traps that rice farmers have set up. And the moves of these dancers are intricate as they move in and out of these beating bamboo poles. And those watching understand the importance of this skill of being able to avoid traps. But there's another theory that I found fascinating regarding the origin, which then became highly significant to this study and trying to frame the kind of peace building that's emerged in the Philippines. So there's this view that tinikling originated during the 1500s when the Spaniards conquered the Philippines. The Spanish initiated large plantations called haciendas, despite, of course, local resistance. The residing indigenous peoples were forced off their land and were moved onto these new Spanish haciendas. And various research sources indicate that the dance was initiated by the forced laborers on the Visayan island of Leyte, and that it portrayed laborers attempting to escape the Spaniards. The author quotes, The dance is said to have derived from a punishment that the Spaniards practiced. Those who worked too slowly in the fields would be forced to stand between two bamboo poles that banged against their ankles. They would jump to avoid the poles, giving them then the appearance of a heron, and tinikling is a play on the name of a heron. And in order to disguise their rebellion and their hopes for escape, it was the description of the heron that these local folks would offer to the hacienda owners when they were asked for an explanation of the dance that they spent their evenings doing. And so thus tinikling as an evening activity evolved as a way to express a kind of everyday resistance to the Spanish hacienda owners and to build communities of support. Tinikling then began to function as kind of a coded communication in a time of oppression, a skill that then was honed over the centuries, and an ability echoed in the everyday and radical peace-building work that's exhibited in years of all-out war in the island of Mindanao. My next slide, Stephanie. All right, this might look a bit strange, but I tell you, every interview that I did for this project, we either drank out of bamboo cups, the people wore bamboo jewelry, the utensils we used were made of bamboo, or people described themselves as bamboo. Many of those interviews, those interviewed used bamboo as a metaphor explaining their approaches to peace building. Bamboo sways in the wind, even during typhoons, and it represents the colonial oppressor, the defiance then of the superpower emerging from the grassroots. Bamboo seen as strong and creative resource, and thus people used it to describe their peace building. And so bamboo peace building is what I've come to call the everyday peace building approach of the Philippine peace builder. And the metaphor of bamboo captures two key aspects of peace building. First, we have the bamboo peace building that focuses on the necessity of moving between various groups. Just as bamboo sways in the wind, so do Philippine peace builders act as go-betweens for various groups in conflict. Second, bamboo peace building accentuates peace builders who come alongside those impacted by conflict. Bamboo never grows alone. So when you find one bamboo stalk, you'll find another close by. So bamboo is in constant motion. As the wind blows, so does the bamboo stalk, but it holds tight in its place and sways to ensure its survival. And the next slide. Chapter 8 is called The Synthesis, Definitions of Peace and Performativity. And I mentioned to you that I created a whole chapter on definitions of peace, which is in this chapter 8. But also what I want to highlight is a theory of performativity and dialogue that emerged out of my research. I'd been reading Judith Butler in terms of her work on social activism, and she uses the idea of performativity to help her understand activism in context of serious oppression. And I started hearing similarities in the Philippines in terms of the ways that people described how dialogue worked in their context. It was James Austin, who coined the term performativity, uses this example of a wedding ceremony where the two people say, I do, and immediately are married. Philippine peace builders who do dialogue talk about that process of dialogue, and as you walk out of that dialogue, you have become a new person in terms of relationship with the other, which I found quite different than many of the other contexts in which I read about dialogue. Father Bert, one of those that I interviewed, said, but dialogue, to do it, to live in harmony, you have to really communicate, you have to deal with the person. And if that dialogue happens, and this is the performativity, forgiveness will happen, mercy will happen, and we are then changed persons from the act of being together. And the last slide, well, second last slide, next slide though. What emerged were then some peace building proposals, recommendations that I gleaned, 13 recommendations that I have now started to work with various groups in the various groups and organizations in the Philippines to look at what those recommendations might mean for the sort of post conflict agreement that has emerged in the Philippines now. And has shaped my most recent work, which is a chapter in a book on confronting peace, local peace communities, and post-agreement problems. Trying to figure out from Colombia and Philippines, so I'm bringing in the Philippine story, what really ensures that a community can keep together after signing a peace agreement. And the proposals and recommendations that come out of this last chapter are ones that I'm feeding into local processes emerging. I think that'll be enough. You can go to the last slide, Stephanie. Daghang salamat, a language that I learned while working there, just meaning very much thank you. So I think Stephanie and I are now open to any questions.
Great. I also want to mention that Lexington is offering 30% off. And if you are interested in purchasing any of the books, to use the code LEX30 AUTH21, and you just go onto their website, roman.com/Lexington, and you should be able to get 30% off these books. Thank you.
Terrific. Thanks, Wendy and Stephanie. I'm not sure if Charlotte is still with us. I know she has
I am still here.
Great. I know she has to get to a class, but thank you very much for your presentations. We do have a question to start us off in the Q&A. Just a reminder, if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the Q&A. But what we do is we invite you to actually bring voice to your question. So the first question that's in the Q&A is from Melanie. Melanie, would you like to actually ask your question? And I can very happily allow you to do so. I just have to do one thing to do that. Melanie, if you'd like to ask your question, you certainly can.
Well, good afternoon. Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to listen to you both. The question that I put in was on the Lao village level and then the transition to the court system. As you described the 5 levels and 3 rounds in each level, could you give a sense of what the time factor is? If you're going through first the set of 5 village stages, and then what it would even add to it if you switch over into the court system? Thanks.
Yeah, I think, the time, thank you for your question. A good question. In terms of the time factor, the Lao people, their cultural values regarding time, it's not the same as the Western time frame. And so they're not in a rush or in a hurry, and they want to make sure that people have an opportunity to really discuss their issues. And if it takes longer, they're okay with that. I remember being at an interview actually in one of the villages, and all of a sudden in the middle of my interview, someone comes knocking on the door of the village leader. I was interviewing the village leader, and it was already, I think, like 7 p.m. or something like that. And all of a sudden, he's like, excuse me, I'm really sorry, I have to go because the people in my community need me. And so he went and he mediated, during the evening. And so, yeah, so the time factor, if you add all that up, and it's 15 mediation, and if each mediation lasts an hour or 2, so you can see that it does take a lot of time, and so for them it's not such an issue. It's the ability to be able to access these mediators and to have these mediation. And so because these people are in their communities, the access is actually much greater than here in the West, where we have to make an appointment to meet our mediator and to schedule a session. So over there, the people are right there, and they can easily access them. But yes, by the time they get through all 15 mediation sessions, it can be a while. But for them, that is not such a concern for them.
Yeah, thank you.
Next question comes from Dr. Muller. We're happy to have Dr. Adam Muller with us here today. He's the director of the Peace and Conflict Studies graduate programs here at the University of Manitoba. Adam, I've turned on your microphone. Feel free to start your questions.
Thank you kindly, Jason. And thanks to both speakers, Stephanie, Wendy. I think it's really interesting. I have so much to learn. And both of your comments or sets of comments were highly instructive. I have questions for both of you, but I think actually what I'm going to do, partly just not to take up too much room, is maybe direct my question to Wendy first. And it's really a sort of theoretical question having to do with the idea of performativity, which is an idea I've also used and worked with myself. And I know Butler, I teach Butler, like a lot about what she has to say, but the problem with Butler on performativity is she reads Austin, but she doesn't read the people within the philosophy of language and sociolinguistic tradition who work on Austin and push these arguments forward. So Austin's writing this stuff about performativity in the 1950s, but really it's particularly Paul Grice who ends up being the kind of major figure who moves the argument into the present day. And he does so partly by pointing out how performativity requires a stable context within which the performative utterance can take place and be effective, pragmatically effective. So that the marriage vow only works if you're in a framework that makes it clear that when you say I do, you are becoming married. You can't just say I do to some random stranger or even a partner outside of that framework and expect the marriage to be officialized, if you like, to actually come into social reality in the right kind of way. Adapting performativity on that view and that Gricean view then to peace and conflict resolution would seem to suggest you need the kind of framework in place first that makes disputants able to recognize one another as the right kind of discussing, right? There has to be a whole set of what at least one theorist called mutual contextual beliefs established first. And I guess I'm wondering, Wendy, how your approach deals with broader context. What role does that bigger picture of context play in establishing the preconditions for performativity of the kind that you seek to cultivate?
Thanks, Adam. Yeah, I can see why you didn't want to write that down in the
Sorry, it's
chat.
just ridiculous, right? Yes.
Well, I would maybe say quick answer to this. I was inspired by Butler and performativity, and that's inspiration can maybe take things off into your own direction, because I did read those very same kind of issues that you are mentioning in terms of what's the framework sort of grounding for performativity as that kind of theory that could lend itself to peace building really be possible. And here's a couple of reasons why I thought I could still use it, even though I'm using it in a context in an island where there is colonial legacy, there's all-out wars, there's an annihilation of indigenous peoples and breakdown of ancestral lands, and none of that sounding stable, of course. What I looked at in terms of the peace builders that have emerged in that context, all of them are folks who have devoted their lives to long-term peace building. And when they say they're from an international NGO or a local NGO, it is their life. You don't turn off your phone at 5 o'clock and not take those calls. And so these are folks that it's the air that they breathe, and they are constantly with folks in these conflict contexts. And what has emerged is they realizing we need regular contact, nurturing relationships, and we do lots of work to set people up for that dialogue. So internal work within each of the groups. We will not desert you in this process, and then a very planned out, careful process when they are brought together. And that's where I think the stability pieces, and it's stability more as trust as opposed to stability of geopolitical factors, let's say, because those are constantly moving. And so it's within that relationship piece, which is very much a Philippine resource and value, that stability piece comes where I thought I still can utilize that framework with what is sort of seen as the preconditions that you describe. And so whether you might think that, Wendy, have you gone, too far off on that or not? It was looking at what is Philippine culture and identity, and I see relationship and trust is that stability piece.
Yeah, you probably couldn't see me, but I was nodding through a lot of what you were saying. I mean, the relationality part is the part I was missing. I think you had actually mentioned it, but not quite directed it towards the space of my question. But I think that makes perfect sense to me. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you for that.
Adam, could I come back to you if you have a question and as time permits?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, sorry, I don't want to take up any more room. So I'm fine with one question, and I can contact Stephanie privately for the other one later. So it's all good.
That sounds great. Thank you, Adam. And we may have time to come back to you. We may go a few minutes over if Dr. Stobbe and Dr. Kroeker can do that. But the next question, Dr. Arnold, Job Arnold, if you'd like to bring voice to your question, you can certainly do that now.
Sure, thank you. And thanks very much, Stephanie and Wendy, for the talks. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, lots could be said. I put a brief kind of question in the chat. I was just curious, in both of these contexts, Laos and the Philippines, I know that climate change is a growing concern like everywhere, but perhaps even more acutely in some of the island nations. So perhaps maybe I'll just leave it as a fairly open-ended question. But in terms of the adaptation and the ways in which both state level responses to climate change are implemented, but then just at the local level, how people are, dealing with whether it be flooding or extreme weather events, things of that nature. I'm just wondering in terms of adaptive capacity going forward, if you see some of these mechanisms and some of this work you've been doing being applied in that context as well.
Thanks, Job, for the question. So I'll respond first, and then maybe Wendy can respond regarding the Philippines context. I know that in Laos, with different developments and whether they're building dams up the Mekong River and it floods certain communities and villages. And so you hear those kinds of stories and disasters, or the villagers are being relocated to a different location. And now they're experiencing a lot of difficulty because they were used to subsistence farming, and they were used to being able to go into the forest and get some of their food. And now they're being relocated into a different area, and sometimes moved towards the lowland. And it's an environment that they're not used to. And so there has been a lot of conflict regarding those kinds of activities. And I think with the mediation level, it's more difficult for them to address some of those larger kinds of issues, because you have governments, you have international corporations that are coming in and doing this development. And so many times the villagers or people say they have no choice in terms of what is happening to them. And so that's when you look at it and you say, okay, well, what are some cases that might be appropriate for mediation? And what are some cases where they actually need to use the court system, or look at some of the larger legislations that can be put into play. But yes, there are current cases now with development and people being relocated and disasters happening because of flooding from dams and things like that. And so, could that be also part of, as you were saying, climate change and some of the changes that are happening? And some people might say, yes, that's all a part of that as well, and development work that may have not looked into those areas, more closely in terms of how can we prevent some of those floodings. And those floodings have happened even, earlier during my parents' time. They talk about the dams being open and villages and towns being flooded by that. And I know they're happening today as well. So yeah, what are some different mechanisms for resolving these different disputes? I think are good to look at.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Joe. I'll make a brief Philippine response. When I said at the top of my presentation that Mindanao is an island of great natural beauty, code for there's a lot of chance for corruption and destruction of relationships when that's the case. And so when I say that I spent time in the sort of setting the landscape, the greed and grievance kind of conversation, that has been huge in the Philippines. The exploitation of land and a large presence of indigenous people for whom their identity, their very being, their Mother Earth being destroyed. So what's emerging out of these peace builders who have spent a lot there that are grounded in the context, and because of kind of tiered layers of peace building, have pushed at, in this case, mining corporations. So you have bared mountains and then climate devastation resulting from that. Pushing at their need to understand their impact in the environment. And so there's a particular group called Peace Builders that's doing a kind of coming between with an indigenous group and a mining corporation where the Datu, the elder, and the community is given an opportunity to teach the spiritual dimensions of the natural world to those corporations, and opportunity to hold them to accountability around those kind of things. I see those kind of conversations happen very strongly in the Philippines because there's this mutual understanding that, to say briefly, yes, climate is the next edge of destruction there.
Terrific. Thanks, Wendy. And thank you, Dr. Arnold. We do have a couple of our PAC students with us today, and Jennifer Tessero has a question. And Jennifer, if you'd like to ask your question, I think it'd be great if you can.
Hi, can you hear me?
You sure can.
Oh, that's great. That's great. Thanks so much for everybody for having me. I'll keep it brief. This question is for Dr. Kroeker. Thank you so much for the presentation. It was really insightful for me, and I learned a lot as well. I was wondering, when you were working with the peace weavers in Mindanao, when you were collecting their narratives, were there any sort of indications of the role of the Filipino diaspora in terms of conflict influencers? Their either their support or their lack thereof, or anything like that?
Having lived there for a long period of time, I can kind of see into the space of your question. I don't spend time on that in my research, but let's just say most of the activists that I engage with and did for this study would say, please come back and engage in your country. We need you right now. And although they would also say, please do what you can in terms of, say, joining Mine Watch, anti-mining groups, that kind of thing, understanding the need for political pressure. But there is a tension point there in terms of activism and feeling that it should happen at home on the ground. Please come back. So I'll just give that as sort of a short thing. Feel free to contact me for more conversation on that.
Thanks, Dr. Kroeker. Cheers.
Awesome. Thanks, Jennifer. And maybe we'll take one more question. If Wendy, I know Wendy is on a road trip back to Winnipeg after months away, and she's borrowing in the office of a pastor. If you'll let you stay there for a little longer, there's a couple more questions. This next one, I think, is though for Stephanie. And we have a good friend of ours from the Rotary, Roy McPhail. And Roy, would you like to ask your question? I'm just going to see. Oh, it looks like, I wonder if Roy had to go. You know, he did. Roy could not stay on, but you know what? It's a good question. I'm going to read it. I don't know if you can see it, Stephanie. Are mediations where the parties are always in plenary, typically separated, or vary from together to separated depending on the mediator and circumstances? Maybe I can read that again if you want. You're on mute there, Stephanie. Sorry. Stephanie, you're on mute there. So
yeah. So I think I got the question. And in terms of the Noigaigia, what they do is they do have individual meetings with the parties in conflict to try and figure out, what the conflict is about and to get the context and further information. And they also meet individually, like the whole committee meets individually with the party in conflict as well as his or her support network to get a wider perspective on the conflict. And then after they do all of that, that's when they call for a joint meeting, where now you have the 7 committee members plus the parties in conflict and all their support networks. And so this can actually become, quite big depending on the participants and those who have been affected by the conflict and whether they want to bring their support network to the mediation. So there are definitely different stages, and some stages there are smaller groups of people meeting, and then you have the joint meeting, which tends to be much bigger. And then the Noigaigia also then goes into their own meeting once they have had a joint meeting and they've had a discussion about the issues and conflict, and they have looked at ways to address the dispute, and they have heard from everyone's perspectives and suggestions. Then they themselves will meet as a committee privately to discuss all the things that they have heard in the mediation, and then they come up with a resolution to the conflict based on everything that they have heard. And it is a consensus model, so everyone on the committee has to come to an agreement about what needs to be done to resolve that conflict. So you can see, the different stages and the different groups of people that are meeting during the Noigaigia mediation. So it's much more complex than just going to your parents and talking to them about your conflict and having them mediate that. And so when you're in a larger kind of conflict and you're going through the Noigaigia, it does become more complicated. And if it's a conflict between different villagers or different ethnic minority groups, again, you'll have your separate meetings with the different groups, and then you'll call everyone together for a bigger mediation session.
Terrific. Thanks, Stephanie. You know what? If it's okay, we'll have one last question to close out today's lecture, and I want to thank you in advance as we finish this last question for having you on again. Terrific to hear the stories. I will never look at the Philippine dance again in the same way. That's for sure. It always made me reach for my ankles, but now there's a lot more depth and history and story behind it. So I appreciate that. So thank you to both of you. Our last question, we'll turn it back over to Dr. Muller for a final question.
Thanks a lot, Jason. And I just add my thanks as well to the speakers again. I think it was just a great presentation, really, really thick, really interesting. And my last question is for Stephanie. Not a big question. It's a naive question. Like I don't have an answer I'm looking for, but whereas I am deeply sympathetic and completely understand the turn to the local that's sort of animating, amongst other things, critical emancipatory peace building and related projects. I think it's important, to somehow escape the dominating structures of the state, etc. Nevertheless, I'm sort of aware that there are within local environments hierarchies and structures of oppression that are also in need of overcoming. And I guess it's against that backdrop that I have a question about the Noigaigia. Specifically, you mentioned the different groups involved, like representatives from different parts of the social whole who sort of participate in this process. How is the eligibility for participation in the process determined? I mean, you mentioned there were women's representatives and so forth, but who's making those calls? And I guess I'm wondering if, I assume it would be a fairly patriarchal sort of context. Like, how are particularly women becoming involved in this process on their own terms?
Thank you, Adam. That's a good question. It is patriarchal, but it's also matriarchal as well in some ways. If you look at marriages, for example, when young people get married, it's the husband that moves into the wife's home and moves to her family's village or community, and so it's not the other way around. And so she then has her family as the support network. And elders in the communities are also made up of men and women. And so at that level, you do have the perspective of women, and they can be mediators in that case. And I think with the awareness of the unique women's perspective on conflict and conflict resolution, they felt it was really important to have a woman's representative there in the mediation committee, and a young people's representative as well, because younger generations again have different experiences, have different perspective, and so they're invited to be a part of that. And so for these committee, they're actually elected, so by the community, and then they represent the community as part of the Noi Gaigia. And so they are working together for that. And in terms of hierarchy, some people would say, well, the Noi Gaigia, all of a sudden you have these 7 individuals who represent different groups in the community. They're well respected, and so they might be pressured to agree with the committee's decision or resolution. And so there is that concern. But then they said, well, you know what, we had a chance to come together, and we have all of these different perspectives from the 7 different people, and from our families, our friends, our community, social network, and we have been given a voice in terms of the conflict and being able to describe it and describing what it is that we need. So many of them actually feel that by the time they get to the Noi Gaigia level, that they are pretty okay with having the decision be made by the Noi Gaigia at that level. And while they're at the Noi Gaigia level, they still have their parents, they still have their relatives, their elders who are from their community supporting them and saying, we are here for you. And if we look at the terms of the resolution, the community continues to be involved and to be supportive of that resolution. And so it's not like they go their separate ways and it's the 2 parties in conflict who have to deal with all of this, because it's more of a collectivistic culture. Their families, their communities are going to be involved in ensuring that the resolution of conflict is successful. And I didn't get a chance to talk about the rituals of conflict resolution and peace building. That's also a very, very important part of their culture, where you celebrate the end of conflict and you bring people together in order to help rebuild relationships and move towards reconciliation. So yeah, so it's there are all of these different aspects, but they do, part of their cultural value is to respect those in authority. And so the Noi Gaigia, might be seen as someone in authority, but they do have, as I said, their parents, relatives, elders in their communities there as well, supporting them and making sure that the process and the resolution are fair. I don't know if that answers your question, Adam.
That's a fantastic answer, Stephanie. Thanks very much. It's really interesting. Thank you.
Terrific. Thank you, Dr. Muller. Thank you, Stephanie and Wendy. And on behalf of the Morrow Center for Peace and Justice at St. Paul's College and our friends in Peace and Conflict Studies program, thank you for being great alumni who do great work and inspire us and our fellow students who will see this lecture, which is now recorded in the future. And thank you very much. Just a reminder that the Lexington book series, we will link from our page. Of course, you can search it out online. And Stephanie mentioned the discount that's available. So get out there and take a look at those books. And thank you to both of you for participating today.
Great.
Thanks very much, Jason,
for organizing it, and for Charlotte as well. And Wendy, I'm glad the PowerPoint, I'm like, okay, I think I can do it. So it seemed to have worked, right? In terms of me turning the slides for you.
I think it did okay.
It's a collaborative effort.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck
Thanks
on the
all.
road or the ride home, Wendy.
Thanks,
Take
everyone.
care.
Thank you.
Bye now.